We don't want you back here.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me again for some high stakes advantage blackjack. This will be episode 4 of my POV card counting series and is also part 2 of my last video. I'm sure many of you remember how that one ended. Surprisingly, many of you didn't like that. I had to end it somewhere though. There was just too much footage from this session to do it all in one video. I'll try to avoid the cliffhangers in the future because I'm not trying to piss people off. In my last video, I said I was going to shoot for 2 weeks time between uploads, and some of you didn't like that either. It's not just the editing that takes time. Getting footage like this is difficult since I'm not doing any trips at the moment. I can't just come back to my local spots like this every week and play how I do. I've said it before, I'm a blatant card counter and I don't do much to hide it. If I get backed off, the staff will remember me for a while. In October, I'll be going back on the road and I'll be getting tons of footage, so the upload schedule will improve in the future. I'm just trying to be transparent here. Filming the content is the hardest part of this endeavor, especially at the stakes I play. That fact cannot be forgotten. There's a reason not many people are making long-form POV content like this. It's very difficult to film at the table and get good viewing angles. So there will be times where content uploads are slower. I wish it wasn't so, but I will continue to get the videos out as quickly as possible. I should also mention that I've got some ideas now for other relevant content to make videos on, which will help fill any gaps that may come up. Please continue to leave me ideas for videos in the comments if you have them, it's much appreciated. Anyways, thank you everyone for your continued support on the channel. We just hit 10,000 subs, which is just so awesome to see, so thank you everyone. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe for more POV casino action. As was stated last time, I'm playing from a minimum bet of $50 at true 0 or lower to a maximum bet of 2 hands of 1,000 at true 6 or higher. Of course, I'm using the high-low count system to determine these true counts, and if you guys need more info on that, I will leave a link to a video in the description. One thing I totally forgot to mention last video was the game conditions. This is a 6-deck hit 17 game with resplit aces. You can split any card except ace up to 4 times. You can double any first 2 cards and after a split. There is early surrender and they cut off between 1 and 1.5 decks, so the penetration is pretty decent. Before we continue our session from last time, I just want to briefly describe some video format changes. I heard your feedback, and while I can't please everyone, I think this will be a good compromise. The cards' size are going to get shrunk down so they take up less of the screen. I'm going to get rid of the hand totals because they're kind of redundant. Lastly, I'm going to remove the hand result text. Apparently my narration is good enough that it isn't required, so into the bin it goes. With all that said, let's jump back into our session, starting with the double splits we left off on. The session had been pretty rough up until this point. I was at a current loss of $2,400 and we were sitting at a true 5. That means I was betting 2 hands of 800. I was dealt a pair of 10s and a pair of 7s against a dealer's 6. I had big hopes for this hand as I put my money forward to split the 10s. 10s will split against 6 when the count is true 4 or higher. After splitting, I was left with a hand of 18 and a hand of 19. Of course, I also split the 7s, leaving me with a hand of 17 and a hand of 15. We really needed that dealer bust. The dealer flipped a 3 and then a 9 for a total of 18, leaving me with 2 losses, a push, and 1 win. What a waste. The count had raised to a true 6, so out went my 2 hands of 1,000. I was dealt a 12 and a 17 versus dealer's 10. I turned my 12 into a 22. I swear every time I have to hit a 12 in high counts, I get a 10. Every single time. I stood the 17 and prepared for another loss. It's a good thing I was prepared because dealer drew to 18 and I lost my second bet as well. This meant I was buying in again because I was out of chips. True count was still 6 or higher, so I needed enough to do another 2 hands of 1,000. So once I had the chips, I threw out another 2 max bets and was dealt a 17 and 16 versus dealer's 10. Things were not going my way today. I surrendered the 16 and stood the 17. Once again, I braced myself for a loss. And dealer flipped an 8 for 18. My second hand also lost. This shoe was brutal, and sadly it was over, so I was going to have to wait for the positive counts to come again in another shoe. This just goes to show that even as advantage blackjack players, we still lose a lot of the time, and the edge is so small that in the short term, like, you can lose so much. This is nothing compared to some of the losing streaks I've had, so just you guys need to be aware of that as you're starting out in this AP journey, if you are doing it, that there is going to be a lot of losing and you need to be okay with that. By the time the count started to go positive again, I was back to playing solo. Here we see it was a true 1 and I was dealt a soft 17 versus dealers 2. This is usually just a hit, but whenever the count is true 1 or higher, it's a double. So I did exactly that, ended up getting a 4 for 21 and dealer busted. The count stayed at true 1 for the next hand and I was dealt a 20 versus dealers 10. Dealer flipped an 8, so I also won this hand. Where were these cards when I was betting 2 by 1,000? Once again, true 1, I was dealt a 12 versus dealer's 8. I turned it into a 17, dealer flipped a 10 for 18, so this hand was a loss. The $100 bet stayed out, and I was dealt a 15 versus dealer's 7. I hit and got a 10 for 25, so this was another loss. Same bet again, I was dealt a 16 versus dealer's 10. Of course this is a surrender, so I did just that and lost half my bet. After that, the count dropped down into the negatives for one hand, but quickly recovered back to a true 1. I was dealt a 10 versus dealer's 10, I hit and got an 8 for 18. Dealer drew to 23, so this hand was a win. The count had now jumped to a true 2, and since I was playing solo, I put out one hand of 300. I was dealt an 8 versus dealer's 10. I hit it and got 16, which I stood on because the count was positive. Dealer flipped an 8 for 18, so this hand was a loss. The count remained at true 2, so another hand of 300 went out. I was dealt an 8 versus dealer's 6, which is normally a hit, however at a count of true 2 or higher, it's a double. So I tried my luck, was dealt a 5 for 13, and luckily the dealer drew to 23, meaning a win for me. We were now up to a true count of 3, so out went my bet of $500. I was dealt an 18 versus dealer's 10, which of course I stood on, and dealer flipped a 10 for 20, so this hand was a loss. The count had dropped back down to a true 2, so I lowered my bet to 300. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's 6, which I stood on, and luckily dealer drew to 22, so I was paid. Here we see the count recovered to a true 3, so out went my bet of 500. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 4, I stood, and dealer drew to 19, meaning another win for me. My bet remained the same, and I was dealt a soft 17 versus dealer 4. Of course I doubled and was dealt a 10 for 17. Luckily, dealer drew to 22, so I won this $1,000 double. For this next hand, I settled on a true 2.5, so I put out a bet of $400. I was dealt a 19 versus dealer's 2, and dealer ended up drawing to 19, so this hand was a push. Similar story on this next hand, I settled on a true 3.5. I only do this when the count is borderline. I put out a hand of 800, was dealt a 16 versus 6, and dealer ended up drawing to 18. A loss for me. Count was now up to a true 5, so I put out my two hands of 800. I was dealt a 20 and a 7 versus dealer 7. Obviously I stood the 20 and hit the 7, getting an ace for 18. Amazingly, the dealer flipped a 3 and a 10 for 20, so I lost one hand and pushed the other. I was now buying in again because the count was still true 5 and I didn't have enough chips to bet. My two hands of 800 were out again and I was dealt a 20 and a 12 versus dealer's 10. I stood the 20 and turned the 12 into a 22. Like I've mentioned before, I always pull a 10 on a 12 when I'm in the high counts, every time. Dealer drew to 22, so at least my first hand won. True count was still a 5, so I got another crack at it. I was dealt a 6 and a 5 versus dealer's 10. Bruh. I imagine I was rolling my eyes right about now. I turned my 6 into a 17 and my 5 into a 23, so that was a loss. Dealer flipped a 10 for 20 and I also lost my first hand. The count had raised to true 6, so out came the cash again as I was buying in to fund the next two hands of 1,000. I was dealt a blackjack and an 18 versus dealer's 10. Dealer didn't have blackjack, so I was paid out on my first hand. I stood the 18, and surprisingly the dealer flipped a 7 for 17, so my second hand was also paid. The count was now a true 4, so I lowered my bet to one hand of 1,000. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer 7, which I promptly turned into a 24 and lost. The count was back to a true 3.5, borderline true 4, so I put out one hand of 700. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 10, I stood, and dealer flipped an 8 for 18. This hand was a win. All those face cards dropped a true count to 2, so I lowered my bet to 300. I was dealt a soft 17 versus a 4, which is a double, so I did just that. I was dealt a 10 for hard 17, dealer drew to 21, so this hand was a loss. My bet remained the same, and I was dealt a soft 15 versus a 2. I turned it into a 19, and the dealer ended up drawing to 23, so this hand was a win. True count had now raised to 4, so out went my bet of 1,000. I was dealt blackjack and paid out $1,500, which is always okay by me. For the last hand in the shoe, we were back down to true 2, which means one hand of 300. I was dealt a 16 versus dealer's 3, I stood, and dealer drew to 22. We'll take that one too. After that roller coaster of a shoe, I played some negatives for a while until the count started to go up again. Here we see the count was up to a true 1, I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's ace, I drew to 24 and busted. Still a true 1, I was dealt a 15 versus dealer's 6. Of course I stood, and dealer pulled 2 face cards for 26, meaning we got it back. The count dropped down to true 0 for one hand, which ended up being a $100 double that I won, so that was nice. Back at a true 1, with $100 out, I was dealt an 8 versus dealer's 10. I hit, got another 8 for 16, and stood as we were in a positive count. Dealer flipped a 10 for 20, meaning this hand was a loss. Bet remained the same, and I was dealt another 8, this time versus dealer's 9. I hit my 8 into a 22, so I lost this one. The count was now up to a true 2, so I upped my bet to one hand of 300. I was dealt a 12 versus dealer's 9, and somehow I amazingly pulled a 9 for 21. Dealer drew to 25, so I won this hand. Still a true 2, so my bet remained the same. I was dealt another 12 versus dealer's 7. Through some sort of black magic, I was able to turn this 12 into a 21 also. Dealer drew to 24, so it was another win. We had to pause for a second to do a chip refill. Some of the other players who had been playing at my table previously had done very well and took probably 30 purple chips away when they left. It's somewhat nice to play with high rollers like that because it can help take some of the surveillance attention off me. The way it usually goes is, if you're betting the most at the table, the attention will be on you. After all that, the count was now up to a true 3. I raised my bet to 500 and was dealt an 11 versus dealer's 2. I doubled it, of course, and got an ace. Bruh. The absolute worst card to get. Thankfully, I was saved by the dealer drawing to 22, and I won this $1,000 double just barely. The true count and my bet remained the same. I was dealt a 19 versus dealer's 7. Dealer flipped a 10 for 17, so this was a win. I dropped my bet to 400, meaning the count was borderline true 3, but wasn't there yet. It's a good thing I did, because I was dealt 17 versus dealer's 10, dealer flipped a 10 for 20, and I lost. The count was now down to a borderline true 2, so I lowered my bet to 200. I was dealt a blackjack, dealer didn't have it, so I was paid 300. After that hand, I was back down into a true 0 or lower for a few, so I was at minimum bet. Right before the shoe ended, the count came back up to a true 1, so I raised my bet to 100. I was dealt a 15 versus dealer's ace, which I promptly surrendered and lost half of. For the last hand in this shoe, it was another true 1. I was dealt a soft 13 versus dealer's 6, I doubled it and got a 5 for 18. Dealer drew to 21, so this hand was a loss. I was back to minimum bets for a little bit, but shortly into the next shoe, the count hit a true 1, so I put my one hand of 100 out. Here I was dealt a 14 versus 3, of course I stood, and the dealer drew to 20, meaning a loss for me. Still a true 1, I was dealt a 12 versus dealer's 9. I hit and got a 7 for 19, dealer drew to 18, so I won it back. The count had now raised to a true 2, so I upped my bet to 300. I was dealt a 9 versus dealer's 10, I hit and got a 7 for 16. I stood as we were in a positive count, and dealer flipped a 10 for 20, meaning this hand was a loss. Still at a true 2, I was dealt a 15 versus 10, which I promptly surrendered and lost half of. My bet remained the same, and I was dealt a 12 versus dealer's ace. True count was not 3 or higher, so I didn't buy insurance, but sadly the dealer had blackjack, so this hand was a loss. After all that, the true count had dropped back down to 1, so I lowered my bet to 100. I was dealt a 14 versus 10, which I hit into a 23. Another loss for me. And finally we get a little bit of action. Still a true 1, I was dealt a pair of 7s versus dealer's 4. I split and turned it into a hand of 16 and a hand of 17. The dealer drew to 23, so finally we won a couple hands. That continued into the next hand as I got a blackjack on another $100 bet and was paid $150. Once again true 1, I was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 7. Dealer drew to 26, so it was another win for me. After that, the shoe went negative and I was back to minimum bets. By the time the count went up again, in another shoe, I'd been rejoined by some other players. There were several uneventful shoes other than the count going up to true 1 a couple times. Here we have a $100 bet. I was dealt an 11 versus dealer's 10. Of course I doubled and was dealt a 10 for 21. Dealer flipped a 7 for 17, so this one was a dub. Here's another bet at true 1. I was dealt a 13 versus dealer's 10. I turned it into a 17, but it was no use as the dealer flipped a 10 for 20. This one was a loss. Again, the shoe went negative for a while. Luckily, I was playing with some other people to get me through it quicker. Before long, we were back to a positive count, starting with this $100 double at a true 1. I was dealt a 9 versus 4, and on my double, I received an 8 for 17. Dealer drew to 18, so I lost this one. The count was now a borderline true 2, so I put out a single bet of $150. I was dealt a 9 versus dealer's 6. I doubled and was given a 3 for 12. Not ideal. Dealer ended up drawing to 20, so this hand was a loss. Now the count was up to a real true 2, and since I was playing with other people, I upped my bet to 2 hands of 200. I was dealt a 20 and a 7 versus dealer's 9. I stood my 20 and I turned my 7 into a 23. Luckily, dealer flipped a 9 for 18, so at least my first hand won. I upped my bet to 2 hands of 300, meaning the count was now at a true 3. I was dealt a 16 and a blackjack versus dealer's 4. I was paid $450 on the blackjack, stood the 16, and dealer drew to 24, meaning my first hand also won. That is what's supposed to happen when the dealer is showing a low card in a high count, but after watching this video, you can see that's obviously not how it always goes. Count was now down to a true 1, so I lowered my bet to 1 hand of 100. I was dealt an 18 versus dealer's 7. I stood and dealer drew to 20, meaning this hand was a loss. Once again, the count went negative and I played some minimum bets for a while. By the time the count recovered, I was back to playing solo. Here I am at true 2 with $300 on the table. I was dealt a 20 versus dealer's 8. Dealer drew to 22, so I won this first bet. Count was still a true 2, so my bet stayed out. I was dealt a blackjack versus dealer's 5 and paid out $450. Once again, true 2, I was dealt an 11 versus dealer's 5. As per usual, I doubled and was given a 4 for 15. Dealer drew to 20, so this one was no good. Count was now a borderline true 3, and I put out a bet of $400. I was dealt a 19 versus dealer's 3. Of course I stood, and dealer drew to 18, which means I was paid. We were now up to a true 3, so my bet of $500 went out. I was dealt a 17 versus dealer's 10. Not what I was looking for, and dealer flipped a 10 for 20. No good. Count was still a true 3, so my bet remained the same. I was dealt a 7 versus dealer's 10. Again, not what I was looking for. I hit it into a soft 18 and then a 16, which I stood on, but once again dealer flipped a 10 for 20. Another loss. The count was now back to a true 2, so I lowered my bet to 300. I was dealt a soft 15 versus dealer's 9. I amazingly turned it into a 21 and dealer drew to 25, so I was paid. We had recovered to a true 3, so I upped my bet to 1 hand of 500. I was dealt a 19 versus dealer's 9. I stood and prepared for the push, but the dealer drew to 23, so it was a win for me. The count was back down to true 2, so I lowered my bet to 300. I was dealt a soft 15 versus dealer's 9. I drew to 20 and stood, dealer drew to 18, so this was another dub. And just when it looked like it may be time to start winning some money back, I got the dreaded tap on the shoulder. I had officially overstayed my welcome.
3, 2, I'll actually just take off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll color, please.
Are you cashing out? You said or you keep?
I'll keep.
You keep. We don't want you back here.
Okay.
Alright. Keep safe.
Yeah, have a good night.
Alright.
So yeah, as you guys can see, I was backed off. Everyone was super respectful, just doing their job, and that's how it is 95% of the time. All in all, I was able to get 6 hours and 49 minutes in and finish the session at a $2,890 loss, which doesn't feel too bad after being down way more than that at just over 8,000. As I've said before, advantage play is all about the long term, and not every session is going to be a winning one. Today was a tough battle, but it's all about generating that sweet EV, which we did, so all is well in the world. Last video, I said I was going to show you guys how I calculate EV in sessions like this where the table conditions are constantly fluctuating. What I do is take notes throughout the session describing the game conditions and how long I played like that. So I will note the speed at which I was playing, aka the rounds per hour, as well as the deck penetration and how long I played like that. Then I will calculate the EV for said conditions to give me an hourly rate for each line. As I've said before, I use Blackjack Apprenticeship betting software to calculate EV, but there's many other ways to do it. Multiply that rate by how many hours were played for a total EV per line. Then I add all the total EV of each line together, divide by total session hourly length, and boom, you will have the average session hourly rate. This is as accurate as it gets as long as you're on top of your notes, and this is how I always do it in long sessions. That is all I got for you guys today. As you can see, this session definitely needed to be split into 2 videos, but no more cliffhangers in the future, I promise. If you guys want more info on how to become an advantage blackjack player, I will once again recommend Blackjack Advisors. They offer live sessions, Q&As, member chat, giveaways, and other perks. It's a great way to get practice at a table while you perfect your game without having to enter a casino. Link will be in the description. Thank you everyone so much for watching and for all your support and feedback. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're new, and hit that bell to be notified when I upload. My next POV episode will include a bit of team play, so make sure you tune in for that one. Until next time, Quattro out.